Okay, well, with that, then I think we'll turn the time over to our presenter, who's Dr. Richard Swan from the Center for Teaching and Learning. We're grateful for him coming and sharing some time with us today. If you'll please join me in welcoming him to our seminar.
Thank you, and hopefully I can avoid the light in my eyes from the projector. I'll move up here a little closer. So I'm Richard Swan. I work at the Center for Teaching and Learning. I'm the associate director there. I'm also a graduate of the IP&T program back in 2008. And Dr. McDonald was actually with us in that group. I don't remember exactly when you graduated. 2006, okay. Yeah, I was one of those that took every ounce of time that I had to finish. What can I say? Okay. You'll see up here a copy of the mission statement of BYU. That's actually where we take our title, the idea of the total person. We take that from the mission statement. And we use that at the Center for Teaching and Learning in our work with faculty as we try to help BYU fulfill its mission. So we're going to talk a little bit about this. Now, some of this you may not, well, come on. Is that going or I'm in trouble. Okay. Now, I don't know if as students you've heard a lot of discussion about the second century address. As faculty and staff over the last several years, it has been a big deal, right? And this quote has been central to some of that conversation. Now, when this was bubbling up, most of us, and me included, had the impression that gospel methodology was about pedagogy, and it was about how we teach and interact with students. And actually, a colleague, I can't take credit for this, a colleague who was there present in 1975 as a new faculty member, when President Kimball gave this address, said, we've got it wrong, that he understood it because he knew what the context was that this was being said in. And so sure enough, I thought, okay, I looked in the talk itself. And sure enough, this quote comes in the context of scholarship, not in the context of teaching. So then I did a little extra digging just out of curiosity, and I found out some additional things, that the 1960s and 70s were a period where the scientific method was being questioned quite heavily, and methodologies were proliferating right and left, right? So here we have some quotes. What occurred in the 60s and 70s was not simply the proliferation of alternative methods, but a profound crisis about the very foundations of methodology itself. And then what do we mean by a methodology? Well, oftentimes in common usage, we might use methods and methodology interchangeably, right? But actually, this is what it really means. A methodology is the theory of correct scientific methods and procedures, or methodology is the philosophical framework and the fundamental assumptions of research. So with that context in mind, going back to President Kimball's quote, is actually inviting us, I think, to consider our disciplines and their philosophical foundations and maybe reconstruct them from a gospel perspective. So we've actually kind of taken that fairly seriously at the Center for Teaching and Learning. And we're going to explore some of the ways that we've tried to do that. And there we go. So what that would mean then is we should examine some of those fundamental propositions. Here are a few. This is not an exhaustive list. Here are a few. Now, in my opinion, materialism and humanism are still kind of the dominant philosophies, if you will, that pervade our culture at large. And so I've used those. They agree on most things, actually, except for humanism would say that human life is not reducible to material causes. Otherwise, if you look at them, they're almost identical. How does that compare to the gospel? Well, we have some correspondence here. Elements are eternal. right? Which is the same idea that we see expressed over there. But then we also have this idea. Intelligence was not created nor made, neither indeed can be. So intelligence is eternal as well. And one of the characteristics of intelligence is its ability to act for itself. Okay? So, if we want to look at our discipline from a different foundation, here is a good foundation to start with. That human beings are eternal intelligence, clothed in eternal element, with the intrinsic property of agency. We're going to dive into this idea of agency, and especially with this idea that the basis of our Heavenly Father's plan is agency. That seems like a good foundation to start from as well. Okay. So we can derive these from our foundational assumption to say the purpose of teaching is to catalyze learning. What is the purpose of learning? The purpose of learning is to expand agency. And we will explore that idea as we go forward. So what do we mean by agency? Okay. The first thing I'd like to do, and I might be sticking my neck out a little bit here, but in our culture, we have this idea, it seems to me, that agency and choice are synonymous. Agency equals choice, choice equals agency in a mathematical relationship, right? It doesn't matter which order you put them, it means the same thing. Now, I would like to suggest that they're actually not commutative, that agency is something, that choice is a part of agency for sure, but agency is something far greater than choice. Okay, so I want you to be thinking about that as we move forward. Okay. Now, because agency looks different when we consider the total person. So we can ask ourselves, what do we mean by the total person? Okay, we're going to start with this idea first. We're going to begin by defining agency. Here are some dictionary definitions, which, by the way, none of them have the word choice, if you will notice. And here's also Elder Bednar's, oops, one too many, come on. A thing or person that acts to produce a particular result, the ability to make decisions and act independently, capacity, condition, or state of acting or exerting power. And from Elder Bednar, the capacity and power of independent action. Okay. Now, what we're going to do for the sake of simplicity is we're going to kind of combine these ideas into one nice, brief, fairly simple definition of agency. Okay. The capacity and power to think and act independently. And we're going to start by positing this idea that the thinking portion of ourselves is somehow contained inside us. I can't see what you're thinking, but there's stuff going on inside there. But we manifest what we're thinking in our actions in the outside physical and social world. So we'll posit those two spheres that we act in, thinking and acting. So let's take a look at what it means to think, or the inner person. And we're going to borrow from our psychology background, and we're going to look at the 4 domains of psychology. Now, if you look at Bloom, there are only 3. It actually turns out there's a 4th one that's been around from the beginning, but it's been sidelined a little bit. And if you've heard of it, you should pat yourself on the back, because you're in the top probably 1% of people that in psychology. So there is, of course, the cognitive domain. Thinking, reasoning, that's the one we're most familiar with probably. There's the affective domain, which is commonly referred to as emotions or opinions or attitudes. But actually, and more importantly, it's the domain of value, values, and value systems. Okay. Then we have the psychomotor domain, motor skills, how we use our body. But again, more importantly, we can think of that as the means with which we interact with that physical and social world. It's the interface between our inner person and the outside world. Because actually the psychomotor, we often think of that as athletics and music and dance and those kinds of things, right? But me speaking, me reading, me writing are psychomotor activities, right? The act of perceiving, even with my sight, is a psychomotor activity. Okay, and then there's the conative domain. This is the one that has been overlooked routinely. And it is the domain of autonomy, self-regulation, essentially the domain of agency. Okay. Now, we can correlate those with at least one scripture. This is the only scripture where all of these are put together in the same place, unfortunately, because I like it. But basically, you can see the heart makes sense. It would go with that affective domain, right? Now, might, with conative, you might think, well, might, isn't that about strength? Well, yes, kind of. But if you think about the connotation of might, it's also about determination and moral courage and some of those kinds of things, right? Grit. And of course, mind with the cognitive domain and strength with the psychomotor domain. So it feels like we've got a pretty good correlation going on here. It feels like we might be on some pretty good solid ground. So we're going to look at the inner person from this perspective with, again, the psychomotor. I'm not the best artist in the world. This is my poor attempt to try and represent this graphically. But the psychomotor being the interface between the inner and the outer. Okay. And we seek to balance these things, right? They're not always working in concert, and yet we seek to, that's part of the conation side of thing, is how do we regulate things inside us, right? To produce the better effect. Okay. So as we look at to act, let's consider three outward dimensions of agency. And quite simply, we derive these from three ways that the word agency is used in common language. And usually when we use them, we kind of tend to think of them as separate and distinct, but I'm going to actually posit that we should think of them as parts of a whole. Okay? So the first one is pretty easy, right? The individual as agent is able to think and act for themselves. The other way we use that is as a group. As a group, we are acting together as if we were one body. So it's interesting that the word corporation for a business, for a company, right, actually comes from the Latin for body. And the legal concept of a corporation is that is the legal person before the law. Okay? Even though it's comprised of multiple people doing their thing. And so all of these ideas we can think of as a corporate agent, right? It's groups of people, groups of agents, if you will, acting together in common, acting as a body. Now I have this, I think this is really interesting. I think it's really illustrative as well too. This 8-man crew picture right here. One of the interesting things about this is if all 8 are rowing in unison, and they get, maybe you've heard this from the boys in the boat, but they get into a thing called swing. Now, when they're in that place where they're in unison, what actually happens is their effort is less and their power is more. So that's an interesting thing, right? When they're acting in unison, their effort is less and yet their power is greater than if they were doing this individually. I think that's a good metaphor for this idea of agency as a body. Third use of agency is this idea of a principal-agent relationship. Now, that's maybe something you haven't really heard of, so I'm going to explain that a little bit. So the principal is the party of the first part, okay? They're the original person, and they authorize an agent to act in their behalf. Now, as an employee, a boss hires you, and that gives you authority to act as an agent in behalf of that company or business, right? So the principal authorizes the agent to act independently in the interests of the principal. Okay, so you don't act in your self-interest. That gets put way down the list. You act in the interest of the other person, of the principal. So you can see that, right? Parents are agents for their children. They act in the interest of their children to the extent their children cannot act for themselves. Okay. One of the, I would say, revolutionary things about the foundation of the United States of America was the idea that the principal is the people and the agent is the government. So which is the reversal, right, of traditional thinking about government. The people are the principal. They authorize the government to act in their behalf. So the government is the agent on behalf of the principal. And then, of course, we have business agents, talent agents, real estate agents, so on and so forth. As an employee, you're an agent. Okay, so here's another little English lesson. There's a lot of these in here, but English, as you know, has developed from a variety of different languages, primarily Anglo-Saxon, which is Germanic, and French and Latin-based Latin derivatives, right? Well, it turns out that modern English, we have lots of synonyms. One of them is from the Anglo-Saxon side, and one of them is from the Latin or French side. Well, this is actually what happens with agent and steward. So, and just for example, let me give you a few examples. Freedom is Anglo-Saxon, liberty is French Latin. Sacred is French Latin, and holy is Anglo-Saxon. So we've got a lot of those that we can kind of use interchangeably. Sometimes they've drifted to mean different things. But here's one where in this context, the word steward is the Anglo-Saxon equivalent of the word agent. Okay, and you will see that actually in the scriptures as you read that. When they're talking about this context of agency, it will often use the word steward or stewardship in the scriptures. And by the way, the parable of the talents is an excellent example of the principal-agent relationship. The master gives the talents to the servants, and what does he say? Go do something with them, right? Independently, on your own, make more than what you have. And so they are now authorized to act in whose interests? In the interest of the master, the principal, right? And if they do that, they're a good steward. And if they don't do that, then they're not. Okay. So we can actually all connect all of these to this base definition, right? Because it is the capacity to think and act independently in these different contexts, as an individual, as a body, and as a steward. And if you think about it, yes, we're individuals, but we're all members of different groups. And as part of those groups, we're doing things together to accomplish different purposes, right? And we have different roles and responsibilities inside of those groups. And then we all have stewardships as well, too. In fact, anytime you enter into any social relationship, you incur a stewardship with respect to that other person, essentially. This would be the Levinasian idea, right? That there's fundamentally this where's Stephen Yancher when I need him? Right? The other, right? This primordial obligation to the other. As soon as that other is present, we have that obligation. And it's just the way it has to work, because if it doesn't work that way, then everything implodes. Okay. So here then we say, okay, our individual agency is comprised of all of these things, and we're seeking to balance all of these things all at the same time. We want to preserve our individuality. Yes, we do. We also want to work in community. And I put unity there because that's kind of the pinnacle, right, of being in community, is when you are unified, things work better, as the 8-man crew suggests. And then we all have stewardships, right? And we're trying to balance all of those things all at the same time. Okay. So one of the things that says is you should no longer be able to tell yourself, I have my agency, I can do whatever I want. Because it simply just does not hold true at all, right? And certainly not in this context. Okay, so here's our complete representation, our nice little, hopefully it's nice little graphic illustration of the total person as an agent, right? What we're doing on the inside and what we're doing externally in the physical and social world. Okay. Choice is a part of that, but it certainly doesn't comprehend all of that. So here's a few things. Again, individual expression is preserved, right? It's not like we're trying to lose the individual in any sense. At the same time, though, our individual agency is imperfect without others. We can't do all the things that we could do without others. Okay. Prime characteristic of functional groups is unity. Another word for that is Zion. There's a reason we're trying to build Zion. Again, membership in any group automatically entails obligations. And then I want to just note, when we think of stewardship and steward, we often think of this idea of caretaker. It's kind of drifted, right, to that idea that we're just taking care of things, almost like the one talent servant who says, I'm just going to make sure I preserve this safely, right? But actually, we need to start thinking about stewardship in the active sense, that we are actively pursuing the interests of the other party. And I want to show how this corresponds to phrases from the mission statement. Again, meet personal challenge and change, this idea of individuality, bring strength to others, unity, civic duty and service to mankind, stewardship. Okay. So how does this translate into instruction? I just happened to run across this quote and it just really fit. So this is kind of where I thought I could throw it in. Transformation happens when some ideal held in the imagination is lived through practical work and performed by the body. Again, this same idea, right? Inner and outer. Okay. So we all know that traditional education is focused almost exclusively on the cognitive domain. If you go back to Bloom's committee, they were supposed to do 3 taxonomies. First one, of course, was the cognitive domain. The second one was published 5 years later, and the third one was actually never completed by Bloom's committee. Others have tried to finish that off. But it's also interesting to me that the only one that has survived and was updated in 2000, what was it, Ken? 2000, I think. 2000, somewhere around there, is Bloom's taxonomy of the cognitive domain, right? When everybody refers to Bloom's taxonomy, they're referring to the cognitive domain. Well, if we're going to teach the whole person, the total person, we've got to start thinking beyond that, at least, right? And now when we're thinking of the cognitive domain, how is it that we are developing capacity and power through education? One of the ways that we're trying to do this in the Center for Teaching and Learning, and I'll explain this idea a little bit more later, is this idea of disciplinary patterns of engagement. I'll explain that a little later. Also, the affective domain. And again, I'm not just referring to emotions, although that's part of it. But I think we need to think about emotions as value-laden information, nonverbal, value-laden information that we then have to convert, right, into something malleable, something maybe verbal, something close to verbal so that we can use it. But it really is this idea of how do we build in, the word that came to mind was confrontation, but that's not the right word. How do we build in this integration with value and value systems inside of instruction? So it's not this, the goal has been objectivity, right? Or much of education's, at least modern education. And that objectivity has actually not served us very well because we've lost all of those character elements that come with the idea of values and value systems. So now how do we build those back into instruction so that as I'm learning the discipline, I'm also engaging with the values and structuring the value system within myself? And then also, traditional education has been very focused on the individual, right? And even to the point, and even competitiveness, right? The idea of competition. But that's not the total person. We don't live in isolation. So how do we build in intentionally into our instruction opportunities to develop those interpersonal relationships and skills that we need to function in the real world, right? And then also, how do we incorporate elements of stewardship and mutual accountability, which really inheres in that idea of if we're collaborating, we've got to develop those things as well too. Okay. From President Worthen in 2020, we need to believe that our students are capable of doing things that we normally would not think they're capable of. And kind of disabuse ourselves of the notion that they can't do anything until we teach them. Okay, here's how we kind of represent this idea, right? That we're trying to construct a learning experience that incorporates these dimensions into that experience. Okay, and one of the things that we've found, this is a huge task. If I were going to try and do this on my own with my own brain power, it would take me a long time if I could do it at all. So what we've been playing around, and we've kind of found actually that AI has really kind of accelerated and augmented our ability to think about instruction in these terms. So what I'm going to show you are some of the things that we've used AI for. Oops, let me go back here. Now, part of what we do too is we use these with faculty, and some of these things actually, they don't know it necessarily, but some of these things are actually hopefully getting them to reconsider the foundations of their disciplines in the context of the restored gospel. Okay, so cognitive domain, disciplinary patterns of engagement. Most instruction is organized around the logical relationships of concepts. Okay, so it's organized conceptually. What we're saying in the cognitive dimension, right, we're talking about capability. Okay, so how is it that I am expected to act as a member of this discipline? What are the capabilities, skills, abilities that I'm supposed to acquire? Now, what we found, and we're still experimenting with it a little bit, Ken and I and a couple of others, and Tyler back there, is this idea of a disciplinary pattern of engagement. There are things that experts do, and they do it all the time, and they do it so routinely that it's become second nature. They hardly know they're doing it, but there is a pattern, a functional pattern to what they're doing. Okay, so here's one, a pattern of engagement. What do you do in statistics? You formulate a research question. You select a statistical method, gather data, analyze the data, interpret the results, and you communicate findings. And you do that over and over and over again as an expert. but the context changes every time. Your research design is different with all the different conditions of your research problem, right? But it's the same fundamental pattern. So here's another one from healthcare. Diagnose, select a treatment, you administer the treatment, you evaluate the effects, and then you revise as necessary. Now, one of the things with this too is this idea that there are nested patterns of engagement in here. Because here we have this diagnose, okay? Well, there's a pattern of engagement for diagnosing, right? Here's my pattern of engagement. And what hopefully maybe you can start to see is there's structure here that we can actually look at both at a course level, but also at a curriculum level, right? Where do these patterns of engagement fit? You can imagine perhaps a whole course on diagnosing, right? And so on and so forth. But essentially what we're doing is we are organizing, like, how might these patterns processes be deconstructed for learning and then practiced and reconstructed. So we're trying to organize instruction around this functional pattern of engagement. And what that does actually is the concepts don't always appear in their logical order, but they appear in their functional order as necessary, as needed by the context they're in. And the literature on expertise tends to show that we don't really understand the concept until we understand the context in which it works. And so this now has it embedded in the context from the very beginning. Okay, how am I doing? Okay. Okay, the affective domain. So there's an idea of intrinsic and instrumental value. Intrinsic is value in itself, and the instrumental value is what is it good for? So you might think of a diamond, a jewel just has to sit there and look pretty. It doesn't have to be good for anything other than the fact that we just enjoy looking at it. Okay. But a hammer, well, it has to do something. That's instrumental. So we can look at our disciplines in the same way and be thinking, what is beautiful about my discipline? But we can also look at them as well in, whoops, just slow. What's the instrumental value of my discipline? That's often what we tend to focus on, but that's still a good thing to think about. What is the instrumental value of my discipline? What is it good for? How will it help me be a better person? How will it help me serve others out in the world? Okay, one of the interesting things too, is as human beings, maybe we're just greedy, I don't know, but we want both, right? One or the other is just not, it's just not good. We don't want to just be valued, set up on a shelf like this little doll, and you're just so wonderful and you're so whatever, right? And you just sit there and everybody just adores you. I mean, that's nice for a while maybe, but it gets, right? But we also don't want to be just a cog in the wheel. We're just there to, right, instrumental value only. We want both. We want to be recognized intrinsically, but we also want to contribute to whatever else is, what the things that matter to us, okay? So we need to think about that as well as we think about how we interact with learners. Okay, and then every discipline has values and a value system. Now, what's interesting is most of the faculty that we interact with, they would, throughout their whole educational trajectory, most of them have never been asked to consider the fundamental assumptions of their discipline and the fundamental values of their discipline. It's just kind of been taken for granted that that that's just what it is, and you just kind of absorb them along the way, right? But it's actually helpful to address these intentionally and see what they are. So we actually ask, this is the AI prompts that we use with faculty. We ask them to consider, what are the core ontological and epistemological values of my discipline? So we're actually asking them to grapple with some of these fundamental assumptions, right? How might these core values inform your discipleship? How might the gospel, the restored gospel, inform your discipline, the values of the restored gospel? Are there competing and contrasting values within the discipline? In fact, this is kind of the place where you think about it, that's where people have a hard time when values seem to be in competition. And what do we do with that, right? So that's a good thing to know as well, too. And then how might these competing or contrasting values be recognized through the restored gospel? It's interesting to see what happens with faculty when they see what comes back from the AI results. It really kind of is eye-opening, wouldn't you say, Kim?
Just sitting at the table with them as they're going through it, like, oh my goodness, I have a PhD in this. I've never really thought, what are the fundamental epistemological ways? How do we know anything? Or who are we as individuals? Those things are just kind of givens or not really discussed.
Okay. So these other dimensions of agency, the idea of unity and stewardship, and honestly, these do kind of go hand in hand. So, as I mentioned, most traditional instruction is based on the individual. It's focused on the individual. You do everything as an individual. You take your assessments as an individual because we're trying to see what you can do as an individual. I won't get into why, but instead of that, we actually need to think about creating assessments and learning experiences that incorporate this disciplinary proficiency inside community already, right, as part and parcel of our instruction, and not simply throw them into a group project, because that doesn't teach them anything, to make working together an intentional part of our instruction as well, too. And the literature says that about team-based learning, project-based learning all the time, that you can't just put them in a group. You have to teach them how to function as a group. So we want to build that in intentionally. And then the other idea too is, which kind of goes back to the values, but how do we actually have learning experiences and assessments that have an eye towards service to individuals, communities, and families, right? So it's not just this conceptual thing that I'm, that is disconnected from reality in some way. It's actually, what difference does this make in the real world to real human beings? Okay. So this is my final quote. The Lord's call is a call to create learning experiences of unprecedented depth, quality, and impact. And I'd say that's what we're trying to do with faculty, working with faculty to help them accomplish this. And now I will just open it up to questions. Kind of the tip of the iceberg, but
Curious about some of the theories that you have considered and incorporated as you were developing all of this. It seemed I could note, it's a lot of like self-determination theory kind of woven in another, and I'm wondering what theories you really found useful.
It's actually kind of interesting that the ones I found most useful come from systems theory. And they're actually the ones that feed AI. So one of those is the idea of feed forward. and AI systems are feed-forward systems. We actually use the term feedback kind of erroneously when you get right down to it. A feedback system can only detect errors. That's all it does. So you think of your thermostat as a feedback system. Too hot, turn off, too cold, turn on, and all it does is go back and forth between error conditions. That's the definition of a feedback system. A feed-forward system is anticipatory. It's actually trying to look at the future and say, how do I improve my performance now to get to that future, that desirable future? Different paradigm altogether. And so a lot of that really does come from systems theory and that idea of anticipatory systems and all of the things that entails, which a lot of things like self-determination theory, they're playing into a lot of that idea. But fundamentally, our culture is built on a reactive paradigm. That's the scientific paradigm. All effects are the results of preceding causes. The anticipatory paradigm says that agents do not act because of the forces that are impelling them to act. They act based on an intended future. Different paradigm altogether. And when we start thinking that way, it's one of those things where it sounds simple to say, but if you wrestle with it, the implications of it are just like, to me, they're mind-blowing. But
I'm so interested to know some of the outcomes of those discussions. So it sounds to me like you give faculty an opportunity to reflect through these questions that you pose to AI about these underlying assumptions in their disciplines. And I would just love to know how they use that feedback then. Like maybe you can give us examples of like how are they incorporating these ideas about developing the total person into their courses.
So we actually use these AI prompts for the first time in our workshop just this summer. So one of the things we've seen is it certainly has changed the nature of assessment from the whole idea of like a multiple choice test is hard to conceive that it gets at some of these things. So it really has changed assessments into something more along the lines of a project-based or scenario-based, case-based, those kinds of things, right? And then the other thing, and this is one where we're trying to follow up with our faculty this semester to kind of see what they're doing and how well they're doing it. One of the ones that I would say that has kind of followed this before we knew what we were doing was CPSC 651, where again, instead of just teaching the concepts of statistics and so on and so forth, this actually is, here's how you engage. Here's how a professional would engage in this process. And you're going to engage in that process through all the variations, right? So through t-test, ANOVA, correlation, all these things, right? And so you're doing that same pattern of engagement, but you're doing it in all these varieties of contexts, essentially. So that's another way. It's a totally different way of looking at things, right? It really is. And one of the things that we're running up against too, I'll just be honest, is the current system is not set up that way. And the curriculum surrounding these courses is not set up that way. So we're kind of having to navigate a little tension, right, as we try to move this direction, but not just completely disrupt what's going on in the curriculum around it as well too. Well, it's going to be a long process, I think, moving this direction. We're hopeful. Just this past year, the administration has asked all programs to kind of take another look at their program. We're trying to engage in these conversations at the program level as well too, say, what's the culminating experience up here, and how do we construct curriculum in a functional way toward that end goal. So, but again, that's going to be a process. It's going to be a long process.
Faculty perspective,
Yeah.
I went through the first, I think I was your guinea pig for of doing that, and it was interesting, because I'm sitting at a table with statistics professors, and then there's a couple of us that were educators. And we went through this prompt series. And I did the Big 64 course, so maybe in January, some of you will see amazing things, I hope so. Anyway, but what I thought was interesting was you started all the way back to saying learning objectives and take it all the way through, but the way that you had us do it would start with the culminating experience, not just about what should they be able to produce, but also who should they be able to have become, right? And that's the hard, I think that is the hard part when you're like, this is gonna be really hard. I'm like, this is super hard. Because it's changing the way that we look at things from the artifacts to human adjustment, right? And so I don't know. I'm excited for all of us because I think we're on this journey together, but I'm grateful for this approach. And I think it'll be really, we faculty members, not just us, but all around the campus can kind of a big ask. So thank you. It's a big ask for us, actually. So,
Yeah.